Chapter 12. Chris stared at the dogfish as it swam in its tank. He massaged his temples lightly. A headache was forming. He had taken a few aspirin, but so far they proved ineffective. Owen was poring over some dream books in the living room, but Chris was taking no notice. He couldn't stop staring at the hideous, yet oddly cute, creature swimming around in front of him. Was there a nest of these things, and if so, should he go after it and destroy it? His head started to throb again. All thought was suddenly pushed out of his mind, and he couldn't concentrate. The pain was growing in intensity, and everything became non-existent to him. He moaned. After a minute, the pain subsided. When Chris was able to focus again, he saw Owen standing on the other side of the tank, apparently talking to him. "What?" Chris asked. "I asked if you were okay." "No, my head is killing me. I think it might be from the bite." "Does Bentley fascinate you?" "Who's Bentley?" Chris asked, rubbing his temples. "The fish. That's what I named him." "Cute," Chris said sarcastically. "You do know you shouldn't name him. You'll just wind up getting attached." "Too late. I've grown a soft spot for the ugly monster." Chris smiled and rubbed his head again. The headache was getting worse. He cast a sideways glance toward Owen. A moment later, Owen propped Chris's feet onto a big fluffy pillow as Chris got comfortable on the couch. Owen suppressed a laugh and handed him a book, the one about the young wizard. Chris had a confused look on his face. "What are you doing?" he asked Owen. "Making you comfortable for your transformation into a hell beast. You want anything? Pickles with peanut butter? Anything?" "I'll save that for when I'm pregnant," Chris said, as he opened the book and started reading. "Seriously, what is this?" "This is me humoring you. Nothing is going to come of that bite you got from Eric. You're worrying over nothing. He's not a vampire." "This isn't humoring. This is you being an ass. I seriously think something bad is going to happen to me, and—" He paused as he thought of Stephanie. "You two are fine," Owen said, as if he'd read Chris's mind. "Maybe Eric and those other guys are the only ones of their kind, freaks of nature, like Bentley. If it were contagious, don't you think we'd be waist-deep in monsters like them?" "Maybe, but I don't think we should jump to any conclusions until we find Eric," said Chris. "Are you talking about capturing him alive?" "I don't know," Chris said. His head was starting to get worse. "I think it's worth considering, so we can question him." Owen didn't respond, but he looked a little grumpy. "You don't agree?" Chris asked. "It just seems better to kill him and get it over with. Like I said, I don't think he's a vampire, and besides, every time they try to capture the monster in the movies, it always winds up escaping and killing everybody." "This isn't a movie," Chris snapped. "I know. It would be a very boring movie. Our lives aren't interesting enough." Chris laughed at that. It was true. They'd only killed 5 monsters since starting their monster hunting venture, and all had been fairly easy to dispatch. But those days were over. Now one of the monster hunters had been bitten by one of those very creatures. Plus, there was a weird fish monster added to the mix. Their lives were becoming more fascinating by the second. "Do you really think capturing Eric is necessary?" "I do. Maybe we can make an antidote out of his venom. If he has any venom, that is. Then we can kill him." "Something's going to go wrong," Owen protested. "It always does. Just don't let him get away next time." The words were out of Chris's mouth before he even realized it. He looked at Owen and could tell he was mad. "I'm sorry," he added. "Nothing to be sorry about," said Owen. "I did let him get away. He almost bit me and I used my rejector on him. I should have just let him bite me. That way you and I could be in the same boat and I could whine and moan too." Chris didn't say anything. Instead, he jumped up from the couch, grabbed his car keys, and left. Owen didn't go after him. He looked back at the tank, where Bentley was swimming in place, keeping an eye on Owen. "Where did you come from?" he asked Bentley, pausing for an answer he knew he'd never get. Owen paced the condo restlessly. He was jacked up and needed something to do. He thought of looking for Eric, but he didn't have a clue where to begin, and he knew if he went after him alone, he would wind up killing the monster. Better to wait for the others. What else was there to do, though? Then the thought came to him. Owen grabbed a leash and collar from Daniel's room, from Daniel's pet-owning days, and scooped up the small aquarium holding Bentley the dogfish. He grabbed his keys before he left. Minutes later, he walked along Trident River with Bentley on the leash. He left the fish tank in the car. He figured Bentley could survive outside the water for a certain period of time, seeing as how the creature had done it when it chased him and Chris through the woods earlier. Owen's hope was Bentley would lead him to a secret nest, if indeed one existed. After the dream he'd had during the softball game, there wasn't much doubt in his mind the dogfish could be dangerous. Bentley himself was fairly tame, but if there were more dogfish out there, chances were they couldn't be trusted to be the same. Bentley hopped up and down, sometimes running too far ahead, only to get yanked back by the leash. They had been walking up and down the river for 30 minutes. Bentley seemed to be enjoying the walk, not heading in any particular direction. A few times, the two of them even headed back the way they'd come. Owen grew frustrated. "Come on," he said to Bentley. "Show me where your family lives so I can kill them." Bentley looked up at him now with his bulbous eyes, his fishy head tilted to the side. "You don't understand me, do you?" Owen asked. Bentley continued to stare, then, finally, went to the river's edge and took a drink. Owen sighed in frustration and even contemplated going home. But then there was a hard tug on the leash. Bentley had broken free and was now riding the rough current. Owen ran along, trying to keep up. He couldn't let Bentley get away. Bentley was way ahead of Owen now, but Owen was keeping up. He'd always been incredibly fast, even when he was a kid. He used to race his friend Colin all the time when they were young, and always left him in the dust, even though Colin was taller. Owen had only gotten faster since then. How else would he have caught up with Eric last night? Bentley, however, wasn't going with the flow anymore. He was going against it. Owen couldn't believe his eyes. Bentley was actually swimming upriver, and at a surprisingly fast pace. Owen turned and headed in that direction. It wasn't any easier keeping up, though. Finally, he saw Bentley climb out of the water and into the woods on the other side of the river. Owen was coming up on Briar Jorson Road, which passed over the river. He jumped up to the street, ignoring the honking cars, and jumped back down to the path. He stared at the woods in front of him, preparing himself. He tapped his jacket pocket, which appeared to hold a few small, clinking objects inside, and headed in. Chris drove aimlessly through the city, not knowing where to go. He loved driving a stick shift. It made him feel cool. He didn't like it when the weather was bad, though. Once, while showing off to Owen during a rainstorm, Chris had peeled out of a movie theater parking lot and slid right into a ditch due to the slippery road. It only took a minute to back out of it, but it had still been embarrassing. "Sorry for almost killing you," Chris had said. "That's all right," Owen replied. "I was talking to the car." They had both laughed at that little moment. Owen still reminded him of it every now and then, much to Chris's dislike. He didn't want to go back to headquarters and face Owen's ridicule, and he sure didn't want to go to David's party. He liked David and all, but the party noise would surely make his still-throbbing headache worse. He wanted to be with Stephanie, but he didn't know where she was. He didn't think she'd want to return to her own house after what happened, but he decided to give it a shot. It was apparent almost from the beginning that Owen was lost in these woods. Even with the flashlight he brought along, it was impossible to see much. Every now and then, he heard the sound of tiny feet scuttling around on leaves. He assumed it was Bentley, but wasn't sure. He just kept going, pushing branches out of the way to keep from getting his face scratched. He tripped on a rock occasionally, but he didn't let it stop him. Finally, after 15 minutes, he heard rushing water, but it wasn't as loud as the river. He assumed it was a stream. After a minute or two, he found out he was right. A stream lay before him. He looked up and down it. There were rocky surfaces all around, with a huge rock wall on the other side of the stream. Owen headed upstream on a small path, not really sure where he was going. He knew there was an apartment complex nearby. He'd passed it while walking Bentley earlier, but he could not see it now. He continued following the path for a few minutes when he heard splashing. Then he heard a low moan. It almost sounded like a whale, only not as large. The path along the stream abruptly ended, causing Owen to step into the water to continue. But the moment he did, he slipped on the rocks underneath the surface. He fell with a loud splash. He tried pushing himself back up, but the moss covering the rock floor was incredibly slippery. Finally, he got his footing and continued carefully up the stream. He slipped a few more times, scratching the palm of his left hand a little. It started to bleed, but Owen didn't pay much attention to it. He shined the flashlight up ahead to see if anything was there, but he saw nothing. He continued for at least 20 minutes, slipping every now and then on the mossy rocks. It was becoming unbearable. His heart beat rapidly. He was regretting handling this alone, but there really wasn't anyone to help. Chris had stormed off, and Daniel and Alyssa were at a party Owen had refused to attend himself. Finally, he found himself near a pond. The moaning was louder, and so was the splashing. He approached slowly, hiding behind a bush. All he could see, though, was a boulder in the middle of the pond. It was poking out just slightly through the surface of the water, but it was what was swimming around the boulder that shocked Owen most. At least a dozen dogfish were in the water, swimming in circles. Owen was sure Bentley was among them, but he couldn't tell. They all looked the same. Each had softball-sized eyes sticking out the sides of their heads, with black fur covering their reflective scaly bodies. And then, suddenly, the boulder moved. Owen was sure of it. The moaning got even louder. It appeared to be coming from the boulder itself. Then it hit Owen like a punch to the face. The boulder wasn't a boulder at all. It was another dogfish. It was the king of the dogfish. "There you go," said a young voice. Owen saw a boy appear at the edge of the pond. He had a clear plastic bag filled with large chunks of something and was feeding them to the dogfish. All but the king swam over to the young man. They were now making weird yelping sounds that reminded Owen of hungry dogs. It was hard to tell from here what the boy was feeding the creatures, but they seemed to like it. Owen wondered if the boy fed them often. They seemed to have taken a liking to him. Suddenly, the bag was empty. "Sorry, guys," the boy said. "I'm all out." He held up the bag to emphasize the point. The tiny fish creatures began making a new noise now, an unhappy wail. Now the big dogfish seemed to take interest in the young boy standing at the edge of the pond. It started wobbling toward him. The boy took a step back as the other dogfish jumped out of the pond and nipped at his legs. "Guys, I already said I was sorry. I don't have any more hot dogs." He sounded nervous. He was backing away from the pond when he tripped and fell on his back. The dogfish were on top of him in an instant. Owen started to take a step forward when the big dogfish gave a great roar from its bulbous body. The other creatures became even more aggressive. Owen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a buster. He was about to activate it when the big dogfish turned toward him and moaned the loudest moan it could muster. All the other dogfish stopped attacking the boy and faced Owen. It was one of the creepiest things he had ever seen. The dogfish wadded in place as if waiting for further instructions from the Big Daddy. The king gave a great croaky roar, and the tiny dogfish suddenly began swimming toward Owen. He activated the bomb and was about to throw it toward the big dogfish when he slipped on the rock he was standing on. This moss would be the death of him. The buster fell into the water somewhere, but Owen couldn't see it. He started to run when he slipped again, the dogfish right on his tail. Suddenly, a muffled explosion occurred from behind him. Owen covered his head as water rained down on him. A moment later, he stood up and looked to where the school of dogfish had been. He quickly counted 16 of them. All were floating in the water, dead. The Big Daddy, on the other hand, was alive and well in the pond and was now moving at an alarming speed toward Owen. He reached into his pocket to grab another buster, but the king jumped on him and he dropped the bomb, having not activated it yet. The horrible creature was on top of Owen now, trying to bite his face off. He held it back as best he could, but the dogfish was heavy and strong. The slippery wet fur on the creature's body made it difficult for him to get a good hold. The monster's horrible breath made him dizzy and nauseated. Feeling 2 flappy fins on both sides of the creature's body, Owen grabbed them and pulled the dogfish off of him, throwing it to the side. There was only one thing he could think to do. He pulled his hoodie off and slapped it carefully against a nearby rock. He heard the reassuring sound of the tiny bombs all being activated at once. The Big Daddy dogfish lunged at Owen again. He jumped to the side, holding the hoodie in front of the leaping monster. It gobbled the hoodie down in one bite. Owen knew running would be difficult on the slippery rocks, so he dove into the pond where the water was deeper. He felt the explosion before he heard it. The concussive wave swept against his back, pushing him deeper into the water until he hit his head on the rocky floor. He quickly rose back to the surface, gasping. It took him a moment to catch his breath, but when he did, he saw that the Big Daddy was no more. There were pieces of its body floating in the water, its blood turning the clear water black. What remained of Owen's hoodie also floated on the surface. He looked up and saw the boy still standing there. He stood at the edge of the pond, mouth agape. Owen could tell now the boy couldn't be any older than 10. He had on a black shirt with a rock band's logo, one Owen didn't recognize, and tattered jeans. His blonde hair was made up into a faux hawk. "Why did you kill them?" the boy asked. Owen wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. He stared at the boy for a moment and then said, "They were attacking you. They would have eaten you if I hadn't stopped them." "Nuh-uh, they were just playing with me." "It didn't look like it to me, not from where I was standing," said Owen, and then he asked the question he'd wanted to ask as soon as the boy first appeared at the edge of the pond, feeding the creatures. "Were you keeping them as pets?" "No," the boy said, his voice high with shock. "Well, maybe. I just found them a few months ago. I live over in those apartments." He pointed to the apartments Owen had passed while walking with Bentley. "My friends and I fed them a few times. There were 2 big ones, a mom and a dad, but the mom died. I buried her." The boy appeared to be on the verge of tears, but was hiding them as best as he could. Owen felt awkward at the moment. He was still standing in the pond as well. He stepped onto the pebbled edge with the boy. "I'm sorry," said Owen. "It's just, I kill monsters. It's kind of my thing, and I thought they were monsters. And it looked like you were in trouble." "Well, I wasn't. You should have minded your own business, mister," the boy said, the tears flowing now as he turned and ran back to his apartment, which was barely visible from where Owen stood. "You're the monster, and I hope someone kills you," the boy yelled from the darkness. That struck Owen as a little harsh, but he said nothing in return. There was nothing to say. Suddenly, he heard movement behind him. He turned quickly and saw a single dogfish standing on a boulder on the other side of the pond. It stared at him. It was a familiar stare. It was Bentley. Owen was sure of it. Bentley continued to stare for a moment or two, and then dove off the boulder and swam away. Owen walked into the condo half an hour later. He was cold and still a little wet. He was also very tired. He took a quick shower, changed into warm, dry clothes. He already missed his hoodie. Plopped down on his comfortable bed and turned on his TV. Nothing good seemed to be on. He flipped through the channels, hardly taking in what was actually on any of them. The events that occurred tonight had brought to the surface his doubts about what he and his friends did with their lives. Owen had killed a whole family of what he thought were dangerous creatures. As it turned out, though, they were a little boy's harmless pets. Thinking back to the dream he had at the game, he remembered the furry creature being pretty harmless until Owen had held the orb up to it. Then he'd ordered it to kill the other creature. Sure, it had only been a dream, but most of his dreams lately all had something in common: the orb. He knew better than to take dreams lightly. What was this orb? Why did he keep dreaming about it? He didn't worry too much about the things he had killed so far, the 5 vampire-like creatures. But what about the strange things he was more than likely to encounter in the future? Should he and the others even be doing what they do? How could one classify a monster anyway? He had misjudged the dogfish greatly. At that moment, Owen felt like a murderer instead of a monster slayer. He continued flipping through the channels, his eyelids growing heavy. Before he knew it, he was asleep and dreaming. He knew it was a dream because he was walking along a highway. The highway, however, was made entirely of shimmering gold light. There were gaps here and there where nothing but black void lay. Owen feared stepping onto those gaps, feared he would fall into the nothingness beyond. He didn't know where he was walking to or why, but he kept going anyway. This trek was familiar to him, despite the odd location. He looked up to the sky and saw a large black orb where the moon, or sun, should be. It was extremely unsettling. As he continued his mysterious journey, he saw something slowly materialize in front of him. It was a man-sized shadow, and it merely stood there. Owen didn't know whether to walk through it or around. He thought he saw red hair on its head, the only other source of color in this world besides Owen's clothes. "This place is crazy, huh?" the figure asked. Owen jumped in surprise. "Yes, I've never dreamed of this place before." "Oh, this isn't a dream." That caught Owen short as he stepped in front of the figure. "What do you mean?" "I'm real. I reached out my mind to you." "How is that possible?" Owen asked. "We share a link, you and I." The figure sounded like a young man. "Who are you?" Owen asked. The figure shook its head. "That's not important right now." "I think it is. You just said we share a link, and you're real, and this isn't a dream. I don't even know what you look like." "I don't know what you look like either," the figure replied playfully. "You're just appearing to me as a shadow with blondish hair." "Why can't we see each other?" Owen asked. "Because the link isn't strong enough, I'm guessing. This is the first time I've done this." "But why are you doing this?" The figure sighed. "Because I need to ask you for a favor. But first, do you ever dream about an orb?" Owen stared in wide-eyed wonder. "Yes. Do you know what it is?" "Not only that, but I have it with me now." Owen looked for it. "I don't mean with me in this place. I have it with my real body." "How did you get it?" Owen asked. "What is it?" "As to how I got it, let's just say I inherited it. As for what it does, I can only say it was built to bring peace on Earth." Owen thought back to the dream he'd had at the softball game. He'd used it to make one creature kill another. How was that peaceful? "Why are you here now?" he found himself asking. "Because, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, I don't know how to turn the damn thing on." Owen laughed. "How is that possible?" The figure laughed too. "Beats me. The thing is, I think you do know how to turn it on. I need your help." Owen grew suspicious. "What did you say your name was again?" "I didn't, but you can call me Michael." "Well, Michael, I'm not used to strangers walking up to me and demanding strange things." "I see. You want something in return." "That's not what I meant," Owen said quickly. "No, I know. But I think it will encourage you to help me. What do you want?" Owen didn't want to take this seriously, but he couldn't help but thinking about the night his father died, and of all the strange things that happened after. He thought about the creatures plaguing San Sebastian, about his own mysterious strength. He wanted explanations for all of it. But only one question came to mind. What is the orb? There was no doubt to what he was really asking the stranger. He wanted to know everything about it, and he knew the figure was leaving something out, something crucial. "I already told you," Michael replied heatedly. "Why do I feel you're holding out on me?" Owen asked. "Because you have trust issues. I understand." Michael took on a joking, easy tone now. "Isn't there anything else you've always wanted to know?" "What, are you the information genie or something? You can just pluck anything out of thin air and tell me?" Owen was fed up with this. Michael stood there for a moment, motionless. Owen knew he'd angered him with his skepticism. Finally, the stranger asked, "You don't want world peace?" "Not without all the information. I'm not trusting it to some stranger who was holding out on me." "You don't want to know what happened to your mother?" Owen gasped. He had been thinking about her, but chose not to say anything. How did Michael know? "I'm disappointed." Michael took a step forward, reaching out with a shadowy arm. And then Owen woke up. He was still in his bed, his TV on. His heart was racing for some reason. He had dreamed about something but couldn't remember what. He started flipping through the channels to slow his heart when something caught his eye on one of them. He flipped back to the channel. It was the news. A beautiful dark-haired reporter named Pamela Johnson was speaking, but Owen couldn't hear her. The volume was turned down. But he probably wouldn't have heard anything she was saying anyway. His heart was beating too loudly because the picture of Eric himself, superimposed next to the reporter, had his attention. He quickly regained his senses and turned up the volume. "Body of Eric Spencer was found yesterday by a local woman in a wooded area in San Sebastian. Cause of death has not yet been released, but police confirm the young man died over 2 weeks ago." Owen jumped out of bed and was out the door in a flash. He had to get the others together to share this news. 2 weeks? They had just fought Eric last night. But there was no mistaking what Owen saw with his own eyes on the news. Eric's dead body, 2 weeks deceased, had been found in San Sebastian. That meant whoever, whatever, they had been tracking this whole time wasn't the real Eric. A shiver ran through Owen's body as he ran out the front door. What did this mean for Chris? Owen tried calling him several times, but got no answer. Since he had no idea where Chris was, he decided to go for Daniel and Alyssa first.